Welcome back to the Outskirts podcast with Tanner and friends. I'm Tanner, and here's another short story titled The Romanian Vodka Contraband and the Fistfight with Ford, instigated by the humor I found in watching him struggle to eat an ear of corn. About 22 years ago, I got an all-expenses-paid trip to Kandahar, Afghanistan, courtesy of the Louisiana National Guard. In case you don't know, the National Guard is basically Army Light in the U.S., the idea being that you help out around your state of enlistment with, say, natural disasters, and extra garbage detail should the governor ever come to town. At least, that's what the National Guard recruiters might have you believe. Or at least that's how one bamboozled me in the late 1990s. That and a $5,000 signing bonus. The truth about the National Guard, regardless of in which state you enlist, is that the federal government, via the authority of the president himself, can federalize any ragtag group of guardsmen at any time. Interestingly enough, on a rare occasion, a governor has found himself, or placed himself and his state's National Guard, in direct opposition to the will of the federal government. In the desegregation era of the late 1950s, the segregationist governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus. What a fitting sounding name for this guy, but I digress. Anyway, Fabulous Faubus deployed the Arkansas National Guard to encircle Little Rock's Central High School in an attempt to prevent its first black students from attending. Now, these students weren't just showing up of their own accord. The judicial branch of the federal government had already ruled against segregation in public schools, and the president at the time, a guy named Eisenhower, was feeling a little undermined by the state of Arkansas. So what did he do? He federalized those same Arkansas National Guardsmen, effectively seizing control of them, and then he essentially sent them back to the paper mill or their milk routes or whatever. I can imagine the scene at the Arkansas National Guard Battalion, where 250 or so of Arkansas's finest are standing there in company formation. Now, I don't imagine for a second that there weren't at least a few sensible men among their ranks. Hell, the first sergeant was probably a swell and reasonable guy. Maybe his name was First Sergeant Watley. This guy had been to Iwo Jima just a few years before, and he didn't at all appreciate being used as a pawn in some idiotic political chess move. There he stood, exhausted from the stupidity of his supervisor, finally at ease, addressing Company B. "Okay, boys, has everyone turned your rifles into the supply sergeant? I need to get you fellas the hell out of here so I can lock this armory down." Then, glancing to his right, with a roll of his 1,000-yard stare-glazed eyes, he reluctantly acknowledges Private Dilbert's raised hand. "Yeah, go ahead, Dilbert. What is it? Did you get your weapon oiled and turned into the supply sergeant?"
Yeah, thank you, Sergeant. But I was just wondering, I thought Governor Faubus was our guy. I mean, don't we want us, he want us to defend the high school or whatnot.
Heaving a long sigh, First Sergeant Watley graciously responds to little Dilbert's inquiry. "Son, President trumps governor. You understand?"
Yes, sir, but my daddy says that the president is way off on this one.
"Damn it, Dilbert!" shouts the weathered sergeant, now more calmly. "President trumps daddy, son. You understand? Now pack it in, boys. Go home and enjoy your families." And better advice was hardly ordered by a man-at-arms. As for President Eisenhower, being a famous military man himself, and always happy to squash a rebellion, he then called down 1,000 of his troops, the real-deal grizzled soldiers, all from the 101st Airborne Division, to escort the Little Rock Nine safely through the angry mob of local yokels. Now, this is of course a pretty good example in favor of the necessity of the federal government's dominance and control of the respective states' National Guard forces. Trouble is, you don't always get an Eisenhower at the helm. You really ought to check out his farewell address to the country if you want to catch my meaning. Relative to Eisenhower's farewell address, and to my overall point, in the absence of a boneheaded governor, a stint in the National Guard can be a pretty relaxing gig until something disastrous happens. Or until some oligarch strikes a deal to sell more weapons somewhere. Whatever your opinions on the expanding national surveillance programs, or the planned destabilization of governments by economic hitmen, or the expansion of NATO to put it into modern relevant context, regardless of however, whyever, by whomever the proverbial shit is made to hit the fan, the saying holds true that it then rolls downhill. Just ask the families of the 600,000 or so dead Ukrainians. But I digress. Downhill, friends. That's where I've generally made my entrance, and this story is set at the bottom of just such a hill. A mountain, to be precise. At the base of the southern slopes of the Hindu Kush Mountains sits Kandahar Airfield. It was there at that airfield, roughly 2 years into the brave new third millennium since the Savior of the world was born, that I, along with thousands of soldiers from all over the world, was stationed. Our mission? Well, to destroy the axis of evil, of course. But more specifically, my unit was there to frame up some troop housing, some offices for the brass, a few dog kennels, and a giant PX building where a soldier can buy toiletries and a PlayStation and movies and Doritos and Vienna sausages. Basically, a military version of your Super Walmart without the produce section. Ah, what a thing to behold. Capitalism at work on the battlefront. We consisted of a couple hundred students and tradesmen, some ambulance drivers, at least one chaser. Let's see, there were bartenders, a bouncer, more than a few plumbers in training, and all from the great state of Louisiana. We'd been called up, presumably due to our storied prowess in the building arts. I'm talking swinging hammers and laying bricks. We were the 527th Engineering Battalion, after all, and a prouder group of soldiers you have likely not seen since Gomer Pyle's boot camp graduation ceremony. I think that episode was titled Nobody Loves a Sergeant. I remember it brought a tear to my 6-year-old eye. Anyway, back to the story. Among us, Southern gentlemen to a T, the finest the state of Louisiana or Uncle Sam had to offer for that particular job at that particular place and time, at least. And among us was one, perhaps the proudest of us all. In my very squad, and indeed in my very 8-man tent, was situated one Private First Class Ford, or, as I called him, Hey Ford. Ford, who not unlike a surprisingly high percentage of his fellow Louisianan guardsmen, was just as pleased to be living the army life in the stand, as he affectionately called it, as if he were on a summer vacation in the Caribbean with all his extended family, generously paid for by his dear old Aunt Dorothy. If you've ever spent any time in the military, you learn rather quickly that some guys are there because they have to be, maybe for financial reasons. Others may be there because they feel they ought to be, maybe out of some sense of duty or family tradition. But then, there's another type of guy. A type that I think is actually rather rare in the general population of military men, but who for one reason or another is as common as a pair of black socks in the Louisiana National Guard. You see, there were actually plenty of guys among us who beyond all reason, it seemed, genuinely wanted to be there. You know? Like for a good time. Up until this point, the longest many of us had spent playing Army was the 14 weeks we spent in basic training. I remember those nights after a long day of digging and marching and standing in lines, getting yelled at the whole time. I remember laying in my bunk, dreading the morning to come. And that was true for most of us in that dorm room. Each morning was highlighted by the groans of young men waking from dreams of being at home with the rest of the fellows, chasing girls and playing sandlot football, only to have the reality of their situation settle upon them. All right, get up, you first-class ass sniffers. Get up! We got some training to do. It was like waking up to a bad dream. I can still hear the stomping, flip-flopped shuffles to the latrine. It wasn't a very pleasant experience for most. But there was that one guy who never seemed to mind any of it. A guy like Ford. I have a feeling Ford savored every minute of his basic training experience. There's something about a guy like that. Something that allows him to really thrive in an environment, which now, back in Kandahar, was a strange blend of threat of external lethal force and utter oppressive boredom, and with still the occasional macho act by some screaming sergeant. I guess for the sergeant, getting his rocks off by making privates do push-ups, you could almost forgive him for enjoying his deployment a little more than the average walking around peon. But Ford, he was as likely to be on the receiving end of some unwarranted power trip as any private. In fact, I witnessed this type of harassment play out upon him on one occasion, and it didn't seem to faze him one iota. It's like he was where he was always meant to be. Which is why I guess I found it a bit puzzling, the degree to which he exaggerated the spectacular nature of his life in the civilian world. Man, this guy was a bragger. You know the type, always going on about this time they got noticed for doing that thing at this job, or this amount of money they spent on a set of tires alone and didn't sweat it a bit, you know, because of all the money people were always throwing at him for being so great all the time. But for all his braggadocious banter about his civilian job, hanging steel, and making the big-time dough, driving his full-size Chevy around from skyscraper to skyscraper, for all that his enviable civilian life provided him back home, one thing was very clear. Private First Class Ford was pleased as pie to be trotting around in Kandahar. You could see it in the way he carried himself. Loaded weapon draped over his shoulder. Starched fatigues. We were in the desert, so we had desert suede-colored boots, as opposed to the standard issue jungle black boots from the World War II Vietnam era. But you just knew. Ford lamented with a deep sorrow that he was not able to showcase his boot-polishing skill that he had honed over a 5-year period. Yes, Private First Class Ford had a swagger that if Osama bin Laden himself had seen it, might have ended the whole thing 20 years sooner. You know what I mean? Can you see him? You really had the sense that Ford was his truest self in that uniform. And if I'm honest, he did have a certain respectable look about him. Standing there in line outside of the chow hall, a proud half smirk on his face. He even had the right kind of chin for an army guy, you know? Kind of Popeye-ish. I know Popeye was a sailor, but that chin was an army chin if ever there was one. It's a chin that just begs you to give it a good punch on a Friday night. Yes, indeed, Ford appeared to be the model soldier on almost all accounts, and I know with certainty that he reveled in the notion that he was indistinguishable from the regular army soldiers all around us. In fact, I'm almost as certain that in his mind, passers-by, regular full-time Joes, occasionally mistook him for some kind of spectacular Special Forces super soldier, here on a secret mission to face dangers unfathomable by your average infantry man. It's true. To look at Ford, you could almost have imagined him cast in some Hollywood production, crouched down in a C-130 flying low, standing there at the jump door, about to make his heroic exit, but not before turning back towards the camera and giving a big, full-toothed, "Whoa! What in the name of Mike? Are those teeth? What are those? Cut!" Oh man, Private Ford's teeth were so bad. When he drew up an ear of corn to his face to take a bite, only about 1/4 of each of his front 2 teeth ever actually made contact with the corn. This was due to the shape of his teeth. Those front 2 teeth formed a sharp, outward protruding V in the near center of his mouth, while the rest of the teeth seemed to move in disalignment of their own accord. When he smiled, you inevitably found yourself fighting the urge to stare. It was just like gazing at one of those geometric patterns. You know that trippy mall art that when your eyes glaze over allows you to see strange hidden shapes? It was. It was just like that. Because realizing you can't stare directly at his face due to the drawing power of those inconceivable teeth, you're forced to shift your focus to your periphery, but still hold your head in position so as not to indicate disinterest in whatever the guy's saying. You understand the scenario, right? Poor Ford. His was the most unfortunate mouth I had ever seen, and to this day, I have not seen a set of chompers more poorly situated to do the job of chewing food. His teeth were so bad, he would often choke on water. No joke. But man, as a member of his squad, being forced to sit across from him in the chow hall, Ford, who talked way too much in general, but especially with a mouthful of food, tiny missiles of liquefied army peas and macaroni, congealed in the dissolving goo of a bit of dinner roll, would be soaring through the air like shrapnel from an enemy mortar round. Eating with Ford meant you were always at attention, making micro adjustments to your plate and covering your glass of water with your hand, sometimes outright ducking for cover, just barely escaping the onslaught of a cleared windpipe after he'd unintentionally inhaled an unchewed morsel of hamburger steak. how can I ever forget eating with Ford in Kandahar, Afghanistan? It was excruciating. And not just because it would take him an hour and a half just to eat your standard army issue half ear of corn on the cob, but also because, you have to sit across from this indecently intimate toothing of the corn, and you're not supposed to laugh. Well, about 6 months into a deployment into the sands of Kandahar, a camp with a few thousand guys who, apart from the high percentage of Louisiana guardsmen who were still somehow having the time of their lives, the rest of us spent most of the day wishing we could be just about anywhere else in the world. You know when the newness of a thing wears off and you realize you're basically a prisoner warrior of the oligarch class? You can start to lose your couth. In this scenario, the hierarchy and the sort of dog and pony show aspects of military life begin to jade a sane man in such a way that he will inevitably begin to acknowledge and give voice to the rebellion taking place within his psyche. And, if he is particularly sane, when presented with the right opportunity and it bearing little negative consequence to himself, this sane man might, in an exercise of his divine right to think and be as he is if only on the inside, find occasion to step across an established social boundary or two. Say, breaching table etiquette, as in Ford's case. Or, as in the case of my rebuttal to Ford's lack of said etiquette, address the elephant in the room. In the case of Ford's elephant, man, this thing was so horrendous. It was well past time for it to be dealt with. Imagine, sitting there pushing 30 years old, meticulously gnawing one kernel at a time from the cob, with basically half a tooth, then pausing occasionally to unwedge the yellow casing of the kernels from the prominent protruding V-shaped tooth structure, and all in clear sight of other diners. I mean, how can a guy live his whole life behaving this way? It's got to be impacting his social life. Yes, this confrontation was overdue, and maybe I'd be doing him a favor. So, I start out by offering him solutions, just to kind of let him know this ain't no normal thing he's doing here at the dinner table. Hey, Ford, have you tried turning your head to the side, when you eat that? He looks at me like he doesn't know what I'm getting at, But he also had one of those peculiarly shaped mouths that seemed too narrow for a human face. Really, it looked more like the kind of a mouth you might find on a pufferfish or a squid. Just picture a small opening with all the teeth seemingly in a race to exit, only there's just room for one. And it was a tie between the front two. So there he is, yellowed V protruding from his little hole of a mouth, nibbling away at his corn, totally ignoring my suggestion. He continues to ramble on about how much steel he had personally hung in this or that skyscraper back at his civilian job. I then interrupted to suggest that maybe he cuts the kernels off the cob so he could eat it with a spoon, like you do when you're a kid, But he says, "No, I'm fine. Just leave me alone about the corn, will you?" But by this time, it was too late to put the issue of Ford's inability to eat a piece of corn like the rest of us to bed. Half the squad was sitting there listening as I went on about finding a better way. "Look," I said, "it's not your fault you have these teeth situated in your head the way you do. Nobody would blame you if you just picked up that butter knife and sawed off the kernels. Here, I'll do it for you." Back off," he says. "Don't touch my corn, breechin'." Sergeant Satterwhite was the first to laugh. And being the sergeant, this encouraged Maggio to let loose of his amusement. And in half a second, as I labored to demonstrate how Ford might attempt to eat an ear of corn from the side of his face, the whole table erupted as I continued. "Come to think of it," I said, "this may be interfering with your battle readiness." In the Army National Guard, that's the thing, especially in the podunk units like the ones we were called up from. The main thing the big brass was always harping on about was readiness. Ready for what we seldom ever imagined. But here we were, a bunch of weekend warriors in the middle of the desert, engaged in a pronounced war on terror. "Yeah," I said. With your mouth shaped the way it is, I doubt you get a proper seal on the gas mask you carry around there. I bet if you went down to the dental tent, they'd get some braces slapped on that trap immediately." Then Maggio, giggling, chimes in, "Say, Ford, have you ever been to the dentist?" "Yeah, I've been to the dentist. What do you think, I've never been to a dentist?" Ford replied sternly, almost shouting, as miscellaneous food pellets shot out from behind his dizzying array of teeth. I ducked with exaggerated intensity, and more laughter ensued. Slamming his water glass down, the table went silent. Sitting back up, I said questioningly, "Since your adult teeth came in?" Now there's a certain type of guy who can actually be an okay guy to be around when things are not stacking up against him. He might have just the right amount of cynicism and a healthy perspective on the true nature of the world. You know, this guy might be a real decent friend to pal around with, but there's a line which must not be crossed. The ego is a tricky thing, my friends, and it can be very difficult to know which characteristic a guy's ego is hinged upon. Well, I found out that Ford's ego was hinged upon his ability to eat an ear of corn without being made fun of. About a mile and a half or so down the graveled main thoroughfare of our rather large military village, past the Air Force camp, past several of the fences delineating national boundaries of encampment, past the Brits, past the Aussies, was the Romanian encampment. Now this is how it happens. Some cook will be out of canned potatoes. He'll send a message down to all the other chow halls until he finds a source. That's pretty easy to imagine. One early morning in the wee hours of KP duty, a ticked-off chef in charge will bark at some private to run down to the Romanian chow hall and ask to borrow a crate and a half of potatoes. Here, take Private Knucklehead with you. You two go and load up the Humvee. So, vroom, off they go, pulling around the back of the Romanian chow hall with their lights off so as not to disturb sleeping campers. They surprise a couple of Romanian soldiers who, barring a bad case of malaria, appear to be walking around drunk off their asses. And while you may be thinking, that's probably a normal sight for a military base such as the one I've described, the Kandahar airfield was a dry installation. No booze permitted ever at any time. Now you gotta figure this order came down from the top American brass, leading the charge, you know? And while the whole civilized world may have been there to support us in battle, well, the Romanians, being Romanians, they aren't under any circumstance gonna just live their lives without some kind of quality vodka. You know? That's like asking the Brits to leave their tea at home or something. For the Romanians, vodka was as essential to life as water. And, well, the potatoes they made their premium vodka from. Anyways, you can probably now begin to see the potential for the black market that arose around the Romanian vodka. And boy was it ever capitalized upon. I don't know the first thing about the art of distillery, or however else one might attempt to make the world's finest potato vodka, but I know this. For $20 US, you could get a pint of the smoothest, hardest vodka I've ever snorted down. There's no telling how good or bad it really was, because in a desperate situation, good is defined more by scarcity than quality. But I have a feeling it was pretty good vodka by any standard. And I know another thing. It did the job. However word got out about the Romanian vodka trade, it made its way to 2nd Squad, and Ford and I each forked out at least $40 apiece on different occasions to our chow hall supervisor, Specialist So-and-so. She was the designated courier, see? Well, as the months ticked slowly by, our patience and camaraderie slowly dwindled. Until one fateful night, walking back to 2nd Squad tent, I was met outside by our squad leader, Sergeant Satterwhite, who informs me that Ford is pissed drunk and acting like he wants to start some trouble. Apparently still peeved about the spectacle he claims I created. Me, to blame for his ignominious corncob debacle. Well, maybe I was a little to blame. Then wham! The wooden door flies open, slamming against the wooden frame of the 8-man tent, and out walks Ford, frothing at his little mouth. Smiling a coy, squid-like grin, he slobbers the words, "Breachin', you think you're a real tough guy, don't you?" Now, if there's one thing I had learned in my 2 years as a man of the world who'd reached drinking age, those were fighting words. Yes, those very words are known to have been spoken by every town drunk since the times of the medieval tavern, where Ford's ancestors first attempted to barter Monday's eggs for Tuesday's chicken, before stumbling out, dejected and without any poultry product to speak of, and full of mead, the ancient Ford thought to take a physical recourse in his unsuccessful dealings, shouting, "Thou thinkest thou art mightier than I, doesn't thou?" Boy, things don't change much in the course of human history, do they? Here stood Ford, countless generations on from that tavern, still the same man a Ford ever was. "Come on then, Breachin', pull him up." By this time, A small gathering of my squad and a few from the surrounding tents had gathered to watch the show. Like crouched hyenas, they sneered and moaned, as if they could smell blood in the air already. I tell you, modern warfare does strange things to its soldiers. Even my squad leader stood jeering. "Go on, let 'em have it, Breachin'. These are all our guys here now. If you're gonna sock 'em, do it now before the crowd gets any bigger." Well, I was fully prepared to shuffle in a circle while Ford hissed out his drunken disdain, but then somehow he caught me unaware and the assault came. Ford hawked the biggest loogie he could muster, nearly choking himself out, and with that strange beak-like mouth of his, he shot it out at my face with the force of a pellet rifle with just 1 or 2 pumps on it. The offending spittle struck my cheek just below my left eye, and as my head went back and to the right, he grazed me with a right cross on the same cheek. I don't know what snapped in me, whether it was the shock and disgust of being spit on, or the frustration of having to listen to this guy go on about himself all day on the job site for month after month, or if for a second I too had desired the sight of blood. To this day, I don't know why I allowed myself to retaliate in the manner I did. I mentioned the birth of Christ at the beginning of this story, and that is an event I have never taken lightly. As a guy who was generally trying to follow Christ's example, there's a hard, fast rule for me here to turn the other cheek. I could have walked away. I should have walked away. But in a moment of weakness, and peer pressure, and anger, I forgot my convictions, and delivered a solid left to Ford's right eye. His head bounced back, and then sprung forward towards me with the speed and haphazardness of one of those inflatable clown things. Now acting on instinct, I ducked left and delivered a right to his abdomen that sent him doubled over to his butt. Regaining his breath there on the ground, he continued screaming and slobbering unintelligibly as a handful of sergeants seized upon him. It seemed they were trying to talk sense to the guy, blood trickling down from his eye, but there was no use. The Romanian sauce had done its job, and then some. Ford was drunker than Cooter Brown, and that was a big violation of base policy. If word of this incident got around, it could shut down the whole vodka operation with disastrous effects. They quickly hauled him off to sober up in the company headquarters. Nobody ever said anything to this effect, but when I first got a look at him the next morning, before chow, I was certain he had suffered considerably more damage to the face than I remembered delivering. He was as mangled as I'd ever seen a guy after a fight. Well, word quickly got around about my left hook, but I would bet some decent money that a few of the sergeants had a go at him after they carried him away that night. Man, I'll say it again. The things modern warfare does to the psyche of a man are just horrible. As for my part, as for that first punch and the second, well, I'm not exaggerating when I tell you it's one of the things I'm most ashamed of to this day, over 20 years later. If I could go back and show grace in that moment, I would. After all, the guy was pleasant enough when he was sober, and generally happy to be there. What more evidence did I need of the reality of his life at home? Later, on the night of the fight, our platoon leader came in with a couple other sergeants, and they shook down Ford's rack. There they found the Romanian vodka, and a shockingly neatly packed and cared for collection of stolen goods from around the unit. It was all Army issue stuff you couldn't get from the unit back home. Special issue raincoats, fire retardant ponchos, stuff like that which no one was likely to miss in the desert. All taped up and sealed in a box postmarked for home, care of the U.S. Army. I was not a little unnerved to learn that he had taken my bayonet. Think you're friends with the guy and all the while he's ripping you off. Why the Army still issued rifle-mounted bayonets is beyond me, but all this stolen stuff, the bayonet, the rain jacket and pants, the poncho, the Army-issue Gore-Tex bedtime slippers, all of it had one thing in common besides being earmarked for delivery to Ford's home address. All that stuff was scheduled to be turned back into the supply sergeant at the end of our deployment. But Ford, contrary to all his big talking, as I said, he was the type of guy who probably never wanted that deployment to end. But since it did have to end, I think he wanted to keep as much of it for himself as he could. For his collection, you know? We storytellers collect names and funny plot twists and moral conundrums for future stories we may someday write. Jot them down somewhere and hope to stumble across them for later inspiration. This very story had its beginnings on a piece of paper titled Funny Things to Write About. Looking back, I now see that Ford was a storyteller, only he took his stories just a bit further than the average guy. Always casting himself as the central and heroic character, he tried his level best to really act out these stories. To the best of his abilities, you know? I can just imagine Ford out there in the civilian world of regular Joes with pot-bellied bosses named Frank and Norman, instead of, Sergeant so-and-so. I can see Ford there, sitting with the guys on his lunch break, having just climbed down from atop a metal building frame, excited to let rip with the story time. Head to toe in his finest stolen army gear, going on and on, boring everybody to death, except for the little bits of baloney flying out of that crazy mouth, keeping everybody somewhat attuned to his face and on the edge of their seats. Yeah, there he sits, recounting wildly untrue tales of his bravery in hunting down terrorists back in the stand. As for just how much stuff he got away with, I don't think we ever had a real count of how much of what was missing and how much he might have been able to ship home before he finally got caught. You can imagine the inventory nightmare some supply sergeant was faced with at the end of a 9-month deployment overseas. Picture a guy who simultaneously retired from his job as a delivery truck driver back in Shongaloo, Louisiana, and as soon as he sits down on the couch, he opens a letter from Uncle Sam, informing him that he'd be activated to go spend his first year of retirement in the Afghani desert, with the same 350 bozos he's been dreaming of never seeing again for the last 30 years. He was so close to that Army retirement check, he was already looking at fishing boats. Although the deployment would likely not take place for nearly an entire calendar year, Uncle Sam initiated a power play called Stop Loss, which essentially meant, if you think you're getting out before your unit ships off, you ain't. Ah, jeez. The humanity. A year in the desert with those clowns back at the National Guard Armory. Let me tell you, Supply Sergeant Williams will be reporting for duty with a very particular brand of nonchalance. Oh yes. And by the end of that tour, down at his supply depot in those last days in Afghanistan, if some things are missing, some serial numbers aren't matching up, hey, Bin Laden was still out there to blame, and Sergeant Williams didn't give a rat's ass. It's kind of funny in a prophetic sense in light of the way the U.S. Armed Forces did finally leave that country in total, about 20 years after this story takes place. You may recall it was in the news a couple years back. As for Ford's thievery, the theory with some of the other guys was that he was shipping the stolen goods home to sell on the black market, like to unscrupulous surplus store owners, I guess. But I think I knew old Ford better than that. Yeah, the way I see it, the way I imagine it, Private Ford sits there before his co-workers, his men as he imagines them. They, sipping their coffee, waiting for the right moment they can escape this unsolicited routine. With puffed up chest, Ford rocks back on his 5-gallon bucket of bolts he uses for a chair, a great retired sergeant-at-arms, a well-worn hero. His favorite prop in hand, he carves out a wedge of apple, using the very bayonet he used in the stand. Yeah, there he is in all his stolen regalia. What choice did he have, really? Ford the actor. Ford the storyteller. He got away with some real Army gear after all. And 22 years later, it still serves him well as he acts out in the moving theater of his life, fortifying the image to be passed down in story form to his kith and kin. But on the off chance he did scrape together some real dough, I don't know, I just hope, truly, from the bottom of my heart, I hope that Ford, wherever in the world you are, probably walking on top of some high steel beam in Dubai, 2,000 feet up in the air, hanging steel, man, making tons of dough. Wherever you are, I just hope you scraped up enough dough to get yourself a hell of an orthodontist. Jeez, man, what a set of teeth. Hey, Uncle Sam, if you're listening, the least you could do is help this guy out with his chompers. Come on, hasn't eaten a piece of corn in 22 years.
The men who have served from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli.
That's from the Marine film. I know all the words to it.
I'm a 20-year man. I've been a man